For as long as anyone could remember, the island of Sodor was said to be the perfect place on earth. A land where skies are truly blue, the grass is purely green, and everything is peaceful. As late as the 970s, the island was ruled by a king named Godred MacHarold, the youngest son of Harold, the Danish king of Limerick, who fought many wars and defended his home from many battles before his wife and his son escaped to Islay, he himself being killed in a battle with his two eldest sons. Even after the son, also named Harold, reclaimed Godred's kingdom in 1014, battles still continued, and after his own son died in a battle against Thorfinn the Mighty, Harold was banished to Iceland. Years passed, and more kings followed. The people of the island, called the Sudrians, saw the Normans as their enemies, and they reacted negatively to their next king Olaf, being brought up in the court of King Henry I. For this, they chose independency. Then, in 1116, Sigmund, the first king of an independent Sodor, died, leaving behind an heir and some descendants that would rule for 160 years. By October 2, 1263, the last of the heirs, King Andreas, and his childless son Prince Peter were killed in the Battle of Largs. With no heir to the throne, the populace of Scotland led by Alexander III claimed Sodor and the Isle of Man for their own, and when Alexander died, a power struggle followed suit, with Sodor changing hands a great number of times. It wasn't until 1333 that Edward III finally annexed the island and gave them to the Monadicutes, and then William le Scrope inherited the island 50 years later. Ill feelings between Sodor and the mainland continued for the next 300 years. Churches and schools were built, and the Sudrians were seen by Pope Pius Bull as recusants. Of the many major ranks of aristocracy, the land soon ended up with a dukedom and an earldom, some of whom were members of the Council of the Duchy of Lancaster. The world outside the island might have been harsh, but the Industrial Revolution was starting to make life easier for everyone. It began with the manufacturing of textiles, and new machines were beginning to produce goods more quickly and efficiently. However, human hands were still needed to tend to these machines, as well as gathering raw materials and furnished goods. To do this, they needed some form of transportation. Stocks, mail, and passengers from all over the mainland needed to reach their destinations as quick as possible, taking less time than what could be accomplished by horses. Horses around this time were the main power behind pulling trains instead of steam locomotives. English inventor Thomas Newcomen created the world's first pumping engine, used to extract water from mines. The Bessemer process allowed steel to be made inexpensively, building long-lasting steel rails that could overcome harsh weather, rampant diseases, and unpredictable certainties of Mother Nature. Rail travel started to greatly improve to meet certain needs when Richard Trevithick built the first steam locomotive, the Coalbrookdale locomotive, in 1802. This was followed by the first high-pressure steam locomotive, Catch Me Who Can, in 1808. Seeking to make the most of this new invention, a Northumberland engineer, George Stephenson, and his son Robert formed the Liverpool and Manchester Railway in 1823. He and promoter William James surveyed the route along with William Losh, who collaborated with Stephenson on the improvement of cast-iron rails that did not break too easily. John Kennedy, who owned one of the largest spinning mills in Manchester, and Joseph Sandars, a corn merchant from Liverpool, also promoted the railway. The railway took 8 years to construct, and by 1829, the Rainhill trials were to begin with 5 competing engines. The first and only engine to complete the trials was a little one named Stephenson's Rocket. Thus prepared, the Liverpool and Manchester Railway opened the following year to a grand celebration. The new invention gave way to other railways around the world. In America, the Stourbridge Lion and John Bull were built out of imported goods from England, while others formed their own companies to produce its own engines. These included the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, which built the first commercial locomotive called Tom Thumb. The newly created Kingdom of Belgium built its own locomotive called the Elephant, which hauled a train from Mechelen to Brussels in 1835. The industrious Germany created 2 of the first rack and pinion engines some 20 years earlier to be used in factories, but whenever they failed, they could never be brought back to proper working order. But on December 7, 1835, the Bavarian Ludwig Railway created Adler, a beautiful engine who carried passengers, goods, and mail from Nuremberg to Fürth. The prosperous Empire of Russia, which stood for over 231 years under the Romanov dynasty, created its first steam locomotive to run the Tsarskoye Selo Railway, which opened in 1837. That same year, Austria began its first steam railway, the Emperor Ferdinand Northern. Then on the beautiful shores of Italy in 1839, the Bayard and Vesuvio engines began operations on the Napoli to Portici line. It was followed by the Strasbourg to Basel line in 1844, and the Tokyo to Yokohama line of 1870 in Japan, and so on and so forth. In this era, progress of technology was the new thought for everyone who wanted to see results that were larger than life. Even the island of Sodor joined in on the new trend. 2 years before Catch Me Who Can was invented, a rail line simply known as the Railroad was formed to serve the Crovan's Gate Mining Company. It was a horse-powered plateway that ran from Krosny-Kuurne to Balladwale, used for mining copper and ore. For return trips, the force of gravity was used to send the trucks back down to Balladwale. None of the Sudrians had ever seen such a thing like the railroad, so they viewed it as a marvel of the day. When 1820 came along, the line was relayed with edge rails and was extended up to the Bengla Valley. 5 inclines to Ward Fell followed suit. With this advantage, the lines would have less traffic to deal with. Beginning in the decade after Stephenson's railway was accomplished, Parliament began amalgamating railways to expand or conflagrate one's territories. After all, the bigger the land, the more you own. On July 27, 1846, one such Act of Parliament amalgamated 5 railway companies into the London, Brighton and South Coast Railway, which, as the name suggested, ran from the coastal town of Brighton to Victoria Station in the capital of London. The shareholders of 2 of the railways merged into it were unsatisfied with early returns from the investments, and the directors of the companies shared their misery. Its first chairman was C.P. Grenfall, then later Samuel Lang, who defined the territory of not only the railway that he owned, but also the Southeastern Railway, which shared the towns of Croydon and Redhill. Following the completion of the Crystal Palace branch, London Bridge Station was enlarged to handle larger amounts of traffic, as the Crystal Palace itself was a popular tourist attraction that once housed the Great Exhibition of 1851. The LBSCR's first locomotives were previously owned by the 5 railways that made up the companies. John Chester Craven, their locomotive, carriage, and wagon superintendent, built the first locomotives that were officially owned by the company, most of which were built at a servicing facility in Brighton. Craven believed that some of the locomotives he designed were given specific jobs, and the first of them, a series of 222s named after the famous Swedish soprano singer Jenny Lind, pulled passenger trains. Other locomotives like the Ventnor-class singles and the Willow Walk shunter followed suit to expand the new fleet. Not everything was optimistic for the LBSCR in the late 1860s. In 1867, the company suffered a major financial crisis that almost drove them to bankruptcy. The company's shareholders held a special meeting which led to the powers of the board of directors being suspended following a special report. The report also gave the company a wake-up call, with them realizing that they had overextended their much larger projects. Several lines were losing money, and Samuel Lang was brought out of retirement to resume his duties as chairman. In addition, John Chester Craven passed his locomotive duties to William Stroudley, who gave names to almost every engine he designed. As the company took the report's recommendations seriously, which saw the company's recovery in the early 1870s, other investments were at stake in different countries. In America, rail barons used their power and influence to amass their wealth by selling stocks at inflated prices, raising prices to cheat those gullible out of their money, and squashing the competition altogether. Greater speed and power were also necessary to destroy the competition at its insatiable peak, and improved safety features were crucial to make sure that any passenger or crew member would survive a crash. Fixed timetables also saw reason for the devisers at the locomotive works to build engines that were faster and stronger to meet these requirements. One man who brought a great deal of progress to Sodor was surveyor James Spooner. The narrow-gauge Festiniog Railway had caught his eye. He offered to replace the railroad's fleet of horses with steam locomotives, and then offered a coach for the quarrymen to travel safely in any weather. During this period, he rediscovered the lake and hallow of Skarloey, quite by accident. He considered repurposing Skarloey with a spa to the line, along with a hotel and a number of villas for visitors. This would require the line to operate a full-time passenger service. The gravity incline was also reworked to serve coal, merchandise, and passenger luggage. With this change, the railroad soon became the Skarloey Railway, named in honor of the long-lost hallow. In September 1864, Spooner purchased a set of coaches from Brown, Marshall & Co. for £500, along with 2 engines from Fletcher, Jennings & Co. to pull them. The trains were now proceeding to work proudly on the new railway, and a man known to many as Mr. Mack was hired as the first controller. In addition to the first narrow-gauge railway, Sodor also received its first standard-gauge railway 10 years earlier, called the Sodor and Mainland Railway. It was projected to link Barrow-in-Furness with Sodor's ancient capital of Sudbury. An Act of Parliament saw to it that the railway would have enough money to build a branch line to Peel Godred, the fort named after the famous king. A number of hired hands from Scotland and Ireland were hired in record numbers, and 3 engines were brought to work on the railway. One of them, number 2, was named Neil, and he and his Glaswegian brothers were built with an unusual box shape. Yet, despite this odd appearance, they were all very kind and hard-working. Another person with a strong interest in trains was a little boy who was 10 years old. His name was Vere Awdry, and he was the son of Sir John Wither Awdry, who came from a background of landed gentry, and his wife Frances Ellen Carr, the daughter of the Bishop of Bournebay. He lived at Naughton House in Wiltshire with his 11 brothers and sisters: Sarah, Ambrose, Francis, Charles, James, Elizabeth, Herbert, Mary, and Priscilla, not counting his half-siblings Thomas, John, Jeremiah, and Jane. And they often went on holidays to see the many railways of the nation. One fateful holiday in 1864 brought Vere and his family to Fletcher, Jennings & Co. in Whitehaven, where they witnessed the completion of a new engine. Now bear in mind, this is a magical reality where engines, coaches, trucks, and even later inventions like planes, ships, and automobiles could talk. Vere wanted to take a closer look at the engine as he opened his eyes for the first time. The little engine was curious, wondering what he was, before his natural intelligence told him he was a human. "My name is Vere," said the boy. "Do you have one?" The engine's builders, Fletcher and Jennings, drew the names of their twin engines from Sudric and Welsh names. Talillin and Dolgach meant brow of the lake and red meadow, while Scarley and Reneus meant lake in the woods and divided waterfall. Both engines had 4 wheels and no cab. The first half of the twins were painted green, and the other half painted red. The engine Vere met, Skarloey, was looking forward to visiting Sodor, where he could pull coaches full of passengers, or so he thought, but that's another story. Close to Barrow-in-Furness was the Furness Railway. 1 year after the extension from Rolf's Castle to Kirk Ronan was completed, work began on connecting Sodor to the mainland. But severe setbacks dashed almost all hope for the company when the tunnel at Ballyhoo collapsed. Their attempts to erect a bridge over the Walney Channel was done without much success. The wild and uncaring ocean fought back against any object constructed by man. First, it washed away the foundations with a tide, and then later a span was lost when a crane broke. Finally, when the bridge was near completion, a gale wasted so many days and weeks of hard work that all plans were shelved. Meanwhile, things were looking up in America, when its first-ever transcontinental railroad was finished at Promontory, Utah, on May 10, 1869. In 1870, the Great Northern Railway amazed the United Kingdom with a standardized new steam locomotive, the Stirling Single. At 39.45 tons, it could drive across Britain at a top speed of 85 miles per hour, even though it was meant to pull express services at 50. They were inspired by the Great Eastern Railway's own singles, but Patrick Stirling, the creator of the GNR single, had observed that his 222s were running better than his famous creation. Around this time, train carriages were built for new kinds of passengers who could afford them. It was George Pullman, an American engineer who sought to invent sleeping cars that matched the elegance of Europe's great hotels, complete with lounges and comfortable berths. GNR now had the fastest British engine, an honor that once belonged to Stephenson's rocket. As for all the other companies, the next step up in speed and luxury would have to be something just as great. In the 1880s, with the introduction of the most famous luxury train ever made, Express d'Orient, another narrow-gauge line located on the western end of the island, the Mid-Sodor Railway, opened in October of 1880 with the arrival of its first engine Duke, named after Henry John Norramby, the current Duke of Sodor. Several other engines followed, and by 1882 the station of Barrow-in-Furness was built on the mainland, but there was still no way to connect the two lands together. In 1885, the Tidmouth, Knapford, and Elsbridge Light Railway opened as well. A harbour was built at Knapford to serve as the base of the drainage company, A.W. Dry and Cobers. Over to the east, the Wellsworth and Sudbury Railway arranged for a similar harbour at Brendam. Further north, the Cronk and Harwich Railway built a pier out of quarried stone. Nearby, the line branched off into the Ballyswine Tramway, but so little is known about the railway itself that nobody even knows for sure if any tram engines worked on it. Meanwhile, the LBSCR acquired operations of the Bluebell Railway, doing everything it could to ensure that the trains from west to east Sussex ran right on time. A young teenager, whose name would be synonymous with Sodor's railways, by the name of Topham Hatt, also held an interest in trains. In 1894, he decided to find work to help his family by taking on an apprenticeship at Swindon Works and made friends with a young William Stainer. He held a great admiration for the Great Western Railway, whose engines were built from that facility, and often helped the young Stainer with getting out of scrapes with their employer, who promised a bright future for the two of them. 2 years into his apprenticeship, he took a visit to the Furness Railway on holiday, and was impressed by the strength and efficiency of its 440 K2 engines, nicknamed the larger Seagulls. The engine he had his eye on, named Edward, proved to be the friendliest out of all the others he had seen and met so far. That same year, in Wales, a narrow-gauge rack and pinion railway in Gwynedd, intended to attract holidaymakers and day-trippers for a faster means of transportation up Snowdon Mountain, was established. In February 1897, Sodor also arranged to attract tourists by constructing a mountain railway to a hotel on the summit of Culdee Fell. 3 years later, it was the year 1900, the start of a new century, the 20th century, a year of electricity and machines growing bigger and stronger than ever before. Engines of a different kind, the diesel and the electric, were further developed to full efficiency. On June 4, 1900, 5 engines were purchased from Switzerland to provide the Culdee Fell Railway's rolling stock. Its number 1, Godred, honored the famous king, while Culdee, its number 4, honored the mountain. Shanedoini, number 5, was called the Old Man in Sudrick, which brought a bit of teasing from those who spoke it. Nosern 2 and 3, Ernest and Wilfred, were all normal names. Things went swimmingly for about a month, until that fateful 6th of August, when stone lodged between 2 teeth of the rack rail caused Godred to fall off Devil's Back as he came down with a passenger train. Down the mountain he fell, exploding upon impact. Nobody was seriously hurt, but the line was shut down until certain safety features could be improved. Because of this, and a previous accident with the Snowdon Railway's own number 1, some thought that newer machines and locomotives were just too dangerous. In the decade to come, the Great Western Railway's city of Truro would go on to become the first steam locomotive to hold a groundbreaking record speed of 100 miles per hour. Railways were reaching their economic supremacy, and they covered many areas of their native countries. The next generation of LBSCR locomotives were obstructed by a motive power shortage from 1905 to 1912. To accommodate the lack of space for Brighton Works to expand, the railway established Lancing Carriage Works for extra repair and construction on locomotives and rolling stock, hiring more railwaymen in record numbers. Some parts of the main line were electrified for future electric trains, while Herbert Walker arranged a similar ordeal on the LSWR. Meanwhile, architect Alfred T. Fellheimer was in America, overseeing the reconstruction of a larger Grand Central Terminal in New York City for more passenger trains. Around this time, Topham Hatt had moved to Sodor and joined A.W. Dry & Co. with the proposal to build 4 oddly shaped engines known as coffee pots for the Tidmouth, Knapford, and Elsbridge Light Railway. The first coffee pot was named Glynn after his father, and he carried passengers to and from Elsbridge to Farquhar. He then focused his attention on achieving what most seemed to be an impossible dream for the now bankrupted Sodor and Mainland Railway. First, he took to the task of directing unemployed miners into building a tunnel on the south ridge of Tidmouth and designed a Scherzer rolling lift bridge with a total length of 120 feet over the Walney Channel. These events signaled the start of a new change for Sodor's railways and the promotion of Topham to the position of director. The railway's dream was finally coming to fruition. While Sodor's connection to the mainland was strengthening, the LBSCR was in need of newer engines. The E1 classes by William Stroudley were becoming outdated due to a heavier increase in workloads. On January 1912, the Board of Directors appointed LBSC's District Locomotive Superintendent, Lawson B. Billington, the position of Locomotive Engineer. As the son of Robert J. Billington, the previous locomotive superintendent, Lawson had taken the position of draftsman and assistant foreman just 12 years earlier and impressed his father and all the others with his abilities and vision. The influence of the Billington family on the LBSCR's rolling stock had come a long way since John Chester Craven, and it definitely showed. Over the course of 1912, Billington conceived a trio of new engine classes to surpass the older stock, able to pull more passengers and goods to and from London to Brighton than ever before. These new locomotives were to be called the E2, the L, and the K classes. A year after these new classes were ordered, Billington and his crew at Brighton Works set production on the E2 tank engines into motion. The first E2, number 100, was finished on June 30th, and the rest were done later. They each had 6 small wheels, a short stumpy funnel, a short stumpy boiler, and a short stumpy dome with a tractive effort of 21,000 pounds, a length of 32 feet, and a weight of 52 tons. The side tanks, however, proved to be a problem. Initial plans for the E2 called for a total water capacity of 1,090 gallons, which were not sufficient enough to store enough coal or water to perform passenger duties. Noting his mistake, Billington ordered 5 more E2s with extended side tanks. In the end, engines 105 to 110, with a total water capacity of 1,256 gallons, were considered adequate for a total mileage of 50. In fact, the newer E2s would actually exceed the first batch by 20%. But there still wasn't enough coal or water to guarantee a full-time passenger service. Meanwhile, Europe was going through a political crisis. On June 28, 1914, as Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria and wife Sophie, Duchess of Hohenberg, were touring the Bosnian city of Sarajevo in an open car, Gavrilo Princip, cohort of the Serbian nationalist Nedeljko Čabrinović, suddenly fired 2 shots at a point-blank range, fatally wounding them. Both Ferdinand and Sophie were rushed to the nearest medical center to seek help, but died within the hour. The Austro-Hungarian authorities determined that Serbia's protest against the annexation of Herzegovina during the Bosnian crisis of 1908 and the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913 had spread an uproar between the two countries. Anti-Serbian riots occurred the very next day, with Serbian property being destroyed, razed, or pillaged. Because of this, and subsequent events of political matters known as the July Crisis, the Austro-Hungarian Empire had no other choice but to declare war on Serbia and its neighboring allies. On June 15, 1915, Billington hosted a distinguished group of tourists and railway officials for the completion of 105, the first E2 to bear the extended side tanks. Among these visitors was a now-adult Vere Audrey, now the Vicar of Ampfield, along with his current wife Lucy, his oldest son from a previous marriage, Carol Edward, and their son Wilbert, who was celebrating his 5th birthday. Wilbert, who was now old enough to walk, asked his father if he could take a closer look at the engine, who was just waking up. That boy was the first person the new engine ever saw. His first words were simply, "Hello." "Hello," the boy replied back. "I'm Wilbert. Was yours?" The engine tried to think of a name. But his mind, as it was in this newly created state, was blank as a fresh sheet of paper. "Well, all I have is a number." He paused over this newly received number. Then he tried thinking a name for himself. And when Veer came up and introduced himself to the engine, he immediately thought of a name: Thomas. Veer knew his history. He named the engine after Thomas Newcomen, the inventor of the pumping engine and possibly even the father of all engines. Though for personal reasons, he had also named him after his half-brother Thomas, who was the son of Sir John Awdry's second wife and had died 5 years earlier. The newly christened Thomas took a liking to his new name, and so did Billington. The LBSCR officials accepted him a new improvement, celebrated over a light lunch, and planned to start Thomas's trials the very next morning with the Awdrys as his first passengers on a push-pull special run. The day after his completion, Thomas's recently hired driver and fireman began a push-pull trial between London Bridge and Crystal Palace, wearing the passenger livery. He pulled 2 coaches, one first class, the other third class. Aboard for the test run were Billington, Chairman Edward Ponsonby, Chief Engineer Sir Charles Langbridge Morgan, General Manager William de Guise Forbes, the Secretary J.J. Brewer, and several tourists, among them being the Awdrys. They practiced braking, stopping at stations, reversing, and Thomas learned how to read signals and how the guard commands his train to stop or go with his whistle or his green and red flags. Satisfied with his performance thanks to the extended side tanks, the officials of Brighton Works proclaimed Thomas fit for service. Also visiting in the area was Sir Topham Hatt, who was looking for a tank engine to handle shunting duties. He met Mr. Billington and the officials at the Crystal Palace station and offered to purchase Thomas for a few £100. By the beginning of August, Thomas the tank engine would be on his way to the island of Sodor.